І тепер запрошую до слова Андре Хертеля, який виголосить свою презентацію на тему Німеччина 2009-2017 роки. Образи непевної влади. Andre, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you, Pavel, first of all, for inviting me. It's my first talk here at the Polytechnic Institute. Although I'm quite often here in the DAD office, so basically one of my employers, one is the Mohila Academy, the other one is the German Academic Exchange Service, DAD, and its office is around the corner. Before I start my presentation, because I'm not a guy who's basically flying in here. I'm here in Kyiv and I'm always interested, I'm working here in Kyiv at the Mohila Academy. I'm always interested to make people aware of what we do here. So very briefly, what are we doing in Ukraine? I am basically leading, to make it easy, I know it sounds a little bit pretentious. I'm basically leading a master program in German and European studies at the Mohila Academy. We enroll students for 2 years, a 2-year master program, mostly in German and English, in political science. The subjects are mostly related to German and European studies, so political system of the EU, Germany, German foreign policy, what I will speak about today. The DAD is a very huge German organization of the German universities, and it's basically conducting their relations with the academic world outside Germany. It sends 450 lecturers, mostly German lecturers, so lecturers of the German language, in all parts of the world, and there are a few subject-related lecturers. So there are a few political, social scientists, economists, and also people who are studying the law send out. I'm one of these more subject-related lecturers, and I'm based at the Mohila Academy for 5 years. Our work at the Mohila Academy but does not only comprise this master course which we offer, which is connected also to 1 semester the students are studying at Jena University in Thuringia, Germany. It also consists of other activities. We are trying to organize academic conferences. We are trying to publish. We're essentially trying to help young Ukrainian researchers to enhance, according to West European academic standards, and also to basically throw them a lifeline in this very complicated economic circumstances for academics in Ukraine. Our vision is that we want to help Ukraine to reform its social sciences, both in a more institutional infrastructure related way, so books, libraries, offices, what else you need, but also in a content-related way. We want to help to enhance standards, to harmonize standards with more experienced, according to more experienced academic systems in the West. And we also want to try to help Ukrainian political science, essentially, to become a school of democracy. That is something what you can very well learn from German political science after the Second World War, where professors in political science really kind of took over the task of re-educating in many ways German society and transform people, students, into genuine democrats. What is my topic today? My topic today is German foreign policy in a wider sense. There will be many connections also to domestic politics, and the main thesis is that Germany is an uncertain power, which I will try to support by a very well-known theory of role models or images in foreign policy conduct. That is the structure of the presentation. I will introduce a puzzle. So why am I interested in this? Why is it interesting to speak about that? Then I will introduce the 2 images one could draw about German foreign conduct, and then I will speak about German behavior in 3 very different crisis situations over the last 10 years, and I will try to find out which image of German foreign conduct prevails in those situations. What's the puzzle here? The puzzle is basically when people, analysts right now, are occupying themselves with German foreign policy, is the major question, so not only posed by me, is the German question coming back. The German question, some of you might be familiar with that, is or has been a central problem of European order from basically the unification, the founding of the German state in 1871 till 1945. The German historian Ludwig de Hio has put the German question or the German problem for Europe and European order in one very easy sentence. Germany is too big not to pose a problem, not to pose a threat to all other European states, but it is also too small to dominate them. And I think this problem, the German question, is very much, very nicely demonstrated in that cartoon of 1955, actually a strange time, but it has some reason, because that was the time when NATO accepted Germany. There was a huge debate in Europe and in Germany whether one should join NATO or one could join NATO or not. And you see here all the other European powers trying to fit this big Germany somehow into a European and transatlantic order. Why should this German question return? This is indeed a good question, because in 1945, or from 1945 onwards, the German question was deemed to be resolved. Germany was divided. It was democratized to a certain point. It just posed no threat any longer to its European neighbors. There was a permissive consensus, a foreign policy consensus arising in Germany that a new Germany should base its foreign policy clearly on multilateralism, cooperation, on transatlantic relations, and on European integration. What should be completely stopped is a foreign policy based on hard power, on the military as an instrument, and on a geopolitical orientation which is locating Germany somewhere between the West and the East, meaning Russia, a role which Germany has traditionally, since 1871, pursued as an arbiter between the West and the East. Even in the 1990s, so after Germany was reunified and its geopolitical setting basically changed, the question of the German problem coming up again in Europe was not posed. Why? Because the country was basically in turmoil. It had to stomach the consequences, the economic consequences of the unification process. And in the 1990s, Germany very much economically, from the economic point of view, was regarded as the sick man of Europe. A weak country troubled by its unification. Now come the 2017 realities. All that changed significantly. Geopolitically, the post-war settlement is basically in doubt. Transatlantic relations are strained not only by the ascendancy of Donald Trump, who's very much disliked by the German mainstream, not only elites, but also society. Brexit, the Euro crisis, they endanger the European Union as basically the framework which has, since the 1950s, provided order to the continent, and Germany itself came back big, geopolitically, an 80 million bloc, not at the border of the continent, but again, like before 1945, in its very center. Geoeconomically, Germany is not the sick man of Europe any longer. It is the best man of Europe. It runs huge trade surpluses over its neighbors. It is one of the most powerful economies in the world again. Personalities, Angela Merkel is perceived as sometimes, especially in Ukraine, people say the leader of the free world, and this is basically, I would say, more salient than any other of the points regarding the comeback of the German question. There is a perception in the neighboring countries, especially in Great Britain, in France, but also in the southern European states hurt by the Euro crisis, that Germany is again this big hegemon in the middle, able to dictate anyone else in Europe what they have to do, how they have to behave. Strangely, this perception is almost completely different inside the country, which, but for foreign policy terms, almost hardly plays a role. This is a cartoon demonstrating that problem, this problem of perceptions. Basically, the man, la mère Pittard, means the Knecht Ruprecht, or a female version of the Knecht Ruprecht. Knecht Ruprecht is the, in the fairy tales, he is the assistant to Nikolaus coming in December to the kids, and he is basically the bad cop who punishes kids who did not behave rightly over the years. So this is the perception of Angela Merkel during the Euro crisis. But there are those superficial views and perceptions, but they are also already well reflected in academia. Ulrich Beck in 2012, he wrote a book. He's a German sociologist who unfortunately already died a few years ago. He wrote a book, The German Europe, and he asked himself what would happen, what happens now with Europe in front of this background of an ascending Germany, of a Germany ascending again to a central role, more powerful than any other role, than any other nation state in Europe has. And he basically says, or his argument is that the new location of the country, but also its policies, its very strict austerity policies in Europe, he calls them Machiavellian, after connecting Merkel and Machiavelli, that they actually could really lead to what Thomas Mann, the very famous Nobel laureate, has already warned of in the 1930s, that Germany would aspire to Germanize Europe, which would be, if one looks at history, the wars, the two world wars, which could be a very destructive process for Europe. Okay. Well, basically, when it comes to German foreign conduct, we can speak about two different images. One image basically stems from the younger history of the country, from its behavior, from its geopolitical position, from its domestic transformation towards a democracy since 1945. And the other one is very much based on its new geopolitical location and its economic prowess. The first one I call the integrated civil power. The integrated civil power is very much connected to Germany's integration into international organizations after 1945, but first of all into the European Union. What you see here is Konrad Adenauer signing the Rome Treaty in 1957. This has been revolutionary for Germany, which little more than 10 years ago was leading a war against all other, basically, except of Italy maybe and a few other partners, against all other European nation states trying to dominate them. Now it basically agrees to give up sovereignty to a higher organ led by the European Commission over its own affairs. In 2007, you can see that Germany belongs to the countries in the world which are most heavily integrated and involved in political integration worldwide, which are globalized to a very high degree. You see here the globalization index that Germany is even more globalized than the United States or Japan in political matters, in social matters, and economic matters. This is reflected, this economic and political foundation of this image as an integrated civil power is reflected in what Helmut Kohl, the chancellor who unified the country in 1990, says, for example, in 1996, as the country with the biggest number of neighbors in Europe, we Germans have a vital interest in avoiding the power rivalries of earlier times, the national egoisms and the changing coalitions between East and West. The main idea of Konrad Adenauer, the first chancellor, must prevail, that German unification and European integration are two sides of the same coin. That is a verbalization of this image as an integrated civil power. Nevertheless, one could argue that it was easy for Germans and for German foreign policy to behave like an integrated civil power after 1945. The country was first occupied, to a large degree destroyed. It had no proper army until a very small one emerged again in the middle of the 1950s. It was divided. It was laying at the edges of the Europe at the time during the Cold War. That all changed in 1990, as you well know. The year 1990, the unification not only of Germany but of Europe, you can very well say that this is a geopolitical revolution, or has been a geopolitical revolution for Germany and Europe, which is Germany again, this great, bigger than anyone else, power in the very center of the continent. It's not only about geopolitics, as I said before, it's also about geoeconomics. Especially since the early 2000s, Germany has reversed its economic fortunes from the sick man of Europe. It became the economically most powerful country in Europe, with a huge current account surplus over any other European state, which made Ulrich Beck in his book basically state the thesis that economically Germany is already a hegemon again and can dictate its policies to others. This is a cover of the Rotary magazine 2005, and asking, based on all those grounds I've just presented, is Germany becoming lonely again? Actually, the very interesting thing is, I said that the 1990s were actually a time when this picture, this first image of the integrated civil power basically was still dominant. Nevertheless, there was one coincidence which could be taken as a hint at what was to come already at the very beginning, very shortly after unification, when Germany began behaving already in a very different way, foreign policy-wise. Only a little bit more than a year after unification, Germany went ahead without coordinating with its European or even European partners and even the US in what you see here is a map of the development of the former Yugoslavia, in recognizing the independence of Croatia and Slovenia, in a move which was very much regarded as a comeback of German hegemonic designs for the space between Russia, the then Soviet Union still, and Germany itself, Central Europe. So basically a comeback of those rivalries, basically providing ground for many of the conflicts of the 18th, 19th and 20th century, for this space between Russia and Central Europe. Those two images I have just presented, so the integrated civil power and the hegemonic central power, they also provide for very different policy-making styles. One is connected to international cooperation, multilateralism, to finding common denominators, to sovereignty pooling, especially when one thinks about the European Union, to win-win thinking in international affairs, and to a support for human rights and democracy. This is basically the view of German foreign policy, which has been internalized by Germans between 1945 and 1990, or let's say by the majority of Germans and their political establishment. The hegemonic central power is connected to a priority of German interests and approaches to unilateralism, a certain go-it-alone attitude without consulting others in decision-making. It is about pragmatic integration, not permissive integration, about zero-sum thinking in international politics. I only win when another one loses, and to hard power instrument, basically to a comeback of the military to German foreign policy. Now, how has this played out in different crises between 2007 and 2009 and 2017? The major question here for me is, has this old thinking, this internalized thinking about German foreign policy prevailed in its conduct, or has structure, the international system, the new structure of the international system, basically forced Germany and also incentivized its elites to revert back to the behavior of a traditional central hegemony power? When one thinks about the euro and Greek debt crisis, this is of course one of the cases most discussed here, and which serves basically as the main example for the critics of Germany who say that, oh, here we see it, you're again trying to use your power to dictate all the others what to do. I will not speak about the sources of the crisis. You very well know where all this comes from. The euro and Greek debt crisis, it basically ended with certain bailout packages which were agreed by the other euro states, and Germany was one of the biggest lenders, or became one of the biggest lenders in the course to Greece. It lended over different packages more than 60 billion euros to Greece. Only as a comparison, the Ukrainian state budget, annual budget, is 22 billion euros, approximately. So, over 60 billion euros were lended. Nevertheless, although that could already kind of be taken as a move of solidarity, the perception of this policy decision and its connected reasoning in Germany and Brussels was very different. This is a picture of the Spiegel in 2015, basically showing Angela Merkel in front of an older picture of German Wehrmacht generals after the occupation of Athens in 1941. This picture has a very clear message, resounding in the liberal left spectrum in Germany as well as in the southern European states, that this is the Germany we all feared, and it's coming back now by dictating us how we have to answer to this crisis, and it's basically not listening to us. It's basically not listening to its partners. Well, what's the reality, and how can one, in front of the two images I demonstrated to you, analyze the German policy? Well, there is ample reason here to not be too harsh with Germany and to argue that it's still stuck to its approach as an integrated civil power. Germany's contribution to the rescue packages to Greece were pivotal. Without German help, Greece would have had to leave the Eurozone. It would have been doomed for bankruptcy. Germany even took the initiative for establishing a long-term solution to those financial crises with the establishment of the European Stability Mechanism, and it also, remember, integrated civil power. It also agreed to a strengthening of supranational institutions, so to even more sovereignty transfer in order to avoid those crises to happen again. Nevertheless, I lean here, one has to lean here in many ways more to the other side. Germany clearly also perceived, or Germany also reverted here to traditional instruments of a very German hegemonic approach. It is basically common wisdom that what was expected of Greece for those credit was a certain Spartatat, so a saving dictate. And not only that, those hard austerity measures one demanded from the Greeks were accompanied by a Europeanization of the very German economic model called ordoliberalism. Only very briefly, ordoliberalism is an approach where the state only sets the framework for the economy, but otherwise does not intervene in it. It is based on a very monetarist approach and very strict, very strict financial and budgetary politics. But it was not only about that Germany basically tried to outsource its own economic model on others. It was the very political way it did it by incapacitating the government of Greece, basically putting Greece under the government of the so-called Troika, the International Monetary Fund, the European Council, and the Commission, which were basically empowered to change the social contract in Greece for a time. What's also interesting here is that, and that will that tells us a further message about German foreign conduct, is that Germany was also not very, or German politicians at the time, especially the finance minister, very powerful Wolfgang Schäuble, were also not very inclined to more holistic arguments about how Germany should behave if it would be that kind of hegemony, benign hegemony others would expect of it. For example, the Nobel laureate Joseph Stiglitz argued that the main problem here is the euro itself. It's not the behavior and the policies of those states, it's the construction of the euro. And if Berlin would take a more holistic approach, it would understand that basically its trade surpluses are only possible if others run at the same time huge trade deficits. And if it would take a more holistic approach to the crisis, it would understand that what's needed here is not austerity measures, but a complete reformation of the euro, even more supranationalization, and a debt cancellation for Greece, ultimately, which was complete anathema at the time and is still right now in Berlin. The second crisis, the refugee crisis, might be even a little bit more interesting to you, because I hear a lot, or I discuss this topic a lot with my Ukrainian students. They always ask me very provocatively, why did you let so many Syrians into your country? You're not a Muslim country, this will change everything, you will have huge problems. You know how the Chancellor Angela Merkel approached the problem. Basically in 2015 she took the historic decision at the end of August to very abruptly, without any preparation, open the German borders, which basically triggered an influx of over 1 million of refugees in the course of only a few months. Here's one of the, this is maybe the picture of the decade in Germany. The Chancellor taking a selfie with one of the Syrian refugees somewhere in a camp in Germany. Well, but there is of course another side to this. This is the quota system which was established with the help and basically the inspiration of Germany in the European Union, in the European Council. It is a quota system by which, of course, the pressure of the influx of refugees into Germany should be stopped. And you see here that there are basically very high quotas for the big states and very comparably low quotas for the smaller states, especially the Central and East European states. The reality about this picture is that almost no state de facto implemented this quota system. Most of the Central and East European states especially took only a few thousand refugees. Germany very much, yes, acted here as an integrated civil power still. On the surface, this really looks as if Germany is the most moral, the most benign, the most enlightened European power of the times. There was a voluntary admission of over 1 million refugees since 2015. There was a very uncomplicated opening of the borders. There was a societal and political welcome culture, so refugees were welcomed. Everything was done basically to comfort them. And there was an initiative for an EU-wide solution. But, and this is so interesting, this case study is so interesting because it shows that even a morally very much defensible policy can be regarded as a policy of a hegemon which bullies others around. Why? The decision to open the borders was basically taken unilaterally by Germany and by the Chancellor. The neighbors were not asked, especially those neighbors were not asked, through those territories the refugees were landing up in Germany. There was a very famous quote confirming that by Viktor Orban, who said, "Oh, Germans, they are now, before they have been only imperialists, they are even now they are acting as moral imperialists even." So trying to tell us even what is good and what is bad, right? And one also has to see that after Germany was kind of getting a little bit uncomfortable with so many refugees and it, understood that something had to be done about it, there was an implicit pressure on other EU states who were unwilling to host the refugees, like Hungary, like Poland, like the Czech Republic, to accept this very quota system I just spoke of. And in order now to force them to accept this quota system, there was not only the majority vote in the Council confirming, putting in place the quota system, there was also a huge debate in Germany throughout the political spectrum about sanctions against those very European partners who were not willing to agree to this German welcome culture and the quota system. Last case study, the Ukraine-Russia conflict. Interesting, I guess, in this context, very much. What you see here are two very telling pictures. You see Angela Merkel, I do not know when it was, I think it is in 2013 somewhat. We all know about the very strange relationship between Angela Merkel and Vladimir Putin. There is a very kind of strong personal element here in the current relationship between Germany and Russia. Basically, it is a relationship of distance, of people who dislike each other, who are very much aware of the fact that they stand for very different value systems and political instruments. Well, this is another picture. It looks much more like a cozy relationship than the other one. What you see here next to the Russian president is the Prime Minister of Bavaria, Horst Seehofer. Bavaria is very well known inside Germany for its, well, let's put it like that, for its very much independent approach. Bavaria has been a kingdom as Saxonia before an own kingdom, a state, like, for example, Saxonia also before German unification, especially due to the economic successfulness of Bavaria. This has been a continuous self-perception of independence, a certain degree of independence until now. And Horst Seehofer very much is the one politician crystallizing a certain different attitude towards Russia and this crisis around Ukraine in the German political spectrum. He very much always speaks, since 2013, speaks out for normalization, for a kind of a softer sanctioning policy, for more dialogue with Russia. I haven't heard him saying much about Ukraine, about Crimea or the crisis at all. So now look at how Germany behaved in the conflict. I think the Ukraine conflict basically, and all what happened around, basically for me is a confirmation, in contrast especially to the first case study, a confirmation of the integrated civil power image very much prevailing in German foreign conduct. Germany has been the anchor of the EU sanctions regime. I think if you would have asked someone in early 2013 if something happens in Eastern Europe concerning territorial integrity of one of the states, of the former post-Soviet states, how Germany would react, and if there would be options, and one of the options would have been Germany is the leader of a sanctions regime against Russia, people would have said no, it's not possible. German-Russian relationship is very close because of one insignificant, provocatively said, state somewhere which is troubled by economic crisis for very long revolutions, Orange Revolution and so on, a state we hardly have any dealings with, this would never happen. So this is a surprise that Germany became and is still the anchor of this sanctions regime. Germany took an approach to the crisis which very much showed that international law, the primacy of international law in foreign conduct, which is the basis of this integrated civil power image I presented to you, very much prevails. This has always been the language of the Chancellor, that as long as Crimea is occupied, as long as we have an intervention in eastern Ukraine, the sanctions regime will stand. And we have to add to that there's a very strong German support, and part of that, for Ukrainian democracy, state building, and civil society in Ukraine. I guess if someone will make an overview, we will see after this year that the investment Germany has put into Ukraine, into the transformation of Ukrainian politics, economics, the support for all those dimensions, Ukraine will be one of the biggest receivers of German political and economic assistance for a very long time. However, even here, there are certain tendencies one could connect to this other image, the one of a hegemonic central power. The impression, especially, and I wrote a longer article about that in 2014, was that essentially at the beginning of the crisis, the role of the Chancellor was central. The society was very ambivalent. We even had a majority in early 2013 in Eastern Germany saying that, oh, Germany should rather take its traditional Arbeiter position here, in this case, in this affair, between the West and Russia. Whereas nationwide polls were showing a very clear resistance to a tough approach against Russia too, against sanctions basically. So the role of the Chancellor was central, whereas society was earlier ambivalent. That is to this date true for the left political spectrum in Germany, parts of the SPD, a governing party, and especially the German left, but also the new populist AfD party. And this is even more important for business. German business is of course very skeptic, and you know how influential German industry is. There are multinational corporations like Siemens and Mercedes. And by the way, at the very beginning of the crisis, especially Siemens, the Siemens boss, Mr. Kaiser, was very much one could even say that he was leading a parallel foreign policy towards Russia. And also one could, there are a few more radical observers doing that, one could even see the Normandy format, so this special regulation format, which is supported by the EU, supported by the US, but which nevertheless does not include the EU itself, an EU representative, which does not include the US, and which does not include any of the more anti-Russian or Russian skeptic European states, could be interpreted as a step towards, as a step confirming what we, or what historians have called the German way. So basically a positioning, a self-positioning of Germany, here together with France, as somewhere between the Western Alliance and Russia, as an Arbeiter again. Okay. Conclusions. What's been, how does the balance sheet look like? Well, first of all, coming back to this problem I've spoken about here, and speaking a little bit about this very peculiar approach with comparing foreign policy images. There's a bigger question for Germans posed here. Can you learn out of history, or is it impossible to defy the structure of the international system? Are you basically, is what we experience right now, and some of the cases, for example, the behavior in the Euro crisis, very much speak for that, is what we're experiencing right now a return of history? Is it impossible to avoid those mistakes induced to you by the structure of the international system, your own geopolitical location? Or is it possible to learn out of history and to transfer this picture of the integrated civil power, to transfer it in a time where the environment, where all the circumstances basically provide you more leverage for a hegemonic behavior? I think, speaking about the balance sheet, after analyzing those three case studies, I think the balance sheet is very much positive. Germany, in many ways, prevailed as an integrated civil power. And we see that, or the most significant, or the most obvious this becomes when we ask for the limits of the hegemonic conduct. It's interesting, a few weeks ago there has been an article in The Economist asking if the German bomb would be possible. You all very well know that Germany is not a nuclear power. It has been basically living under the nuclear shield of the US and its European partners, France and the UK. But seeing the deteriorating, seeing Brexit, seeing the deteriorating relationship, especially security relationship with the United States, Donald Trump saying he would even go further in his drawing back from Europe, and the aggressiveness of Russia, of course, some foreign observers were bringing up the question, would Germany now be enticed to develop its own nuclear arsenal, to develop its own bomb, which would basically be the ultimate end of the development towards a hegemonic central power again. And of course what we see is, in Germany, this is absolute anathema. It's not even discussed. It's absolutely not sellable to either parts of the political elite or to the society. The same goes, and we see it with the development of German foreign policy, very obvious, especially in the Ukraine crisis, that the German way, basically meaning this comeback of a foreign policy which is placing Germany somewhere between the West and Russia, is a marginal, very marginal position in Germany, not even taken by the more radical parts of the political spectrum. This brings us to two smaller problems, and I will end with that. The problem of Germany is basically maybe not if the German question comes back, but it is something else. It is that Germany is what Ludwig de Hio and also Hans Pugnani said, it's kind of hybrid hegemony or semi-hegemony. Its major problem is not that it is basically entist towards hegemony, but that it is not able and not willing to take over what comes with hegemony. Huge parts of the German society are against a leadership role in Europe. They do not want Germany to be a provider of order, in a more realist sense. They basically want to live, or they want to go on, enjoy the times under the security umbrella of others. They do not want to take responsibility. The images here, this is what we learned here, are not mutually exclusive, but they are complementary. One could even argue that by mixing the image of an integrated civil power with, or that mixing the image of an integrated civil power with the hegemony Germans are forced to take over is a way, this mixing is a way to avoid the negative outcomes, meaning that one is perceived as a threat by its neighbors. And the very last point, especially the most critical case study has been the one on the euro, the behavior during the euro crisis. And if you reflect on that, the problem of Germans might not be hegemony, but the form of hegemony its foreign conduct takes. If we look back at the critique of Josef Stiglitz, a way out for Germany, or the only way out basically, is a concept like benign hegemony. Think bigger, think in more holistic terms about Europe and European order, and not in provincial, only self-serving terms, and hegemony might be even accepted to a point. This confirms, by the way, a thesis of John Eikenberry about hegemonic stability theory, that hegemony can be accepted by others, by smaller partners, if those smaller partners have the impression they profit more from hegemony, from the hegemony of others, than they lose. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And I'm sure I will have quite a few questions. Don?
Well, thanks for, in the end, a very subtle presentation, I must say. And
thanks.
It's, I think, very encouraging that an official German representative, in a way, such as you, is able to make this sort of a balanced approach. I like that a lot. But this is more a comment than a question, but I would still love to hear your answer to it. The problem with the German position in Europe is, I guess, in a deeper historical sense, that Germany has had very little experience historically with actually leading the continent. It's basically only between 1895 and 1914 that it played that role. All the traditions that it developed in those days have been destroyed with the war and in the period afterwards. So here we have a power that is has simply no experience, has no traditions, no institutional memory and heritage of actually leading. That is one thing. And then the second thing, and here the Germans come actually very close to my own country of birth, the Netherlands. I mean, no, it's not true that Germany is the most successful economic competitor. I think the Dutch are. In many of the years, the Dutch have actually a larger surplus. But the point of saying this is that, so I am not a chauvinist. I am not chauvinistic about that, but the Dutch are chauvinistic about that. They think it is their moral prestige that is being produced in this particular way. And that is exactly the same with the Germans. They think they actually own. It is a property right and a right of propriety, right? To actually be the best competitor economically. Now, of course, this is not sustainable. And here, that tradition of, that historical experience of an absence of leadership comes together with a very particular way of thinking about economics. And then, yes, you come back to ordoliberalism. But my ordoliberal reading is, I think, more Foucault in this. Ordoliberalism is a fantastic way to make everybody think that economics has nothing to do with politics. Absolutely. Whereas it is entirely politically constituted. And so
if you read it more closely, ordoliberalists also do not deny that that the market has to be at some point or the other be regulated.
So it's not about a separation of politics and economics. Ordoliberalism was always about institutionalizing via political mechanisms the ways in which every single unit in a society, every single actor would internalize competitiveness and accumulation as the golden rule of behavior, right? And so two things come together: the absence of leadership experience historically, and the embodied denial of that economics is a politically constituted act. And this all comes together in, the Greek crisis, where the Germans said, we are not leading. But, of course, they are leading. And that is because when you do economics, you are not leading. It's not politics. You see the point? And so I'm really interested, and it's exactly the same with the Dutch, right? And then the identity politics that emerges from that moment, with a lot of national pride about how competitive we are, and everybody could become this if they listen to us, and all of that. So these are very small nations that have never, the Dutch both, as well as the Germans, in the end they are small nations that are embedded in an international system in which the responsibilities are carried by others, and they profit from it. And they want to continue to do that.
I take your point, and I'm not a Marxist, but I think we have one major problem, not with Germany, but with the West, that it is the economicization of everything. On the other hand, and you see this very clearly, that in trying to regulate those crises, especially the euro crisis, the political element is completely forgotten. It is only about economics. How do we save the euro? And how do we make it in a way that German banks, creditors, that German people, in the end the state is a creditor, do not have the impression they in the end lose what they invest here, right? There's no, this refers a little bit to your to your argument about the lack of leadership. There is no thinking about the wider political repercussions about the European project at all. And this is very strange because everyone seems to have, on the other side, in other debates, understood the construction errors of the euro area, right? That basically currency union was established without political union and without macroeconomic union. All true. On the other hand, I guess that it's fair to say also that these last 10 years have provided Germany with a lot of experience how to lead. And I see a positive tendency because I still have the impression with Angela Merkel, we have no other leader to compare this with, that she is, in the end, in a very pragmatic way, I agree, but that she always tries to put a European approach first. One other thing I also wanted to say, to end this on a positive note, you say that Germans and the Dutch, they defined their national prowess by this economic success. I mean, this is already a step forward in history. 100 years ago, it was military prowess.
That is correct.
Military capabilities and victories on the battlefield which were defining our prowess. If it is economics right now and doing better economically than others, this could be interpreted already as a step forward.
But that is precise. So it is an internalization of having lost the military hegemony worldwide, right? So it's an internalization of being a small state, of being a non-hegemonic state. But that is exactly the problem at this moment in time. I mean, the UK is out, Brexit. The south of Europe is, in particular Italy and Greece, are in an eternal crisis. There is a massive confrontation going on between Visegrad and the core. And then the core doesn't agree with each other even. No, so I mean, when you look at the actual problems of the EU, they are tremendous and they are accelerating. But the non-capacity to think about politically and making the necessary steps, the non-capacity to think politically about this situation is just really flabbergasting. And that is because these are post-imperial powers. No? It's the same for the Dutch. I mean, we were an imperial power in the 17th century. We don't have a bomb and all of that now, but we compete. And it's just with the Germans. They compete.
It's much more fierce with France and the UK, this problem of post-imperialism in acting right now. But I agree with you. I mean, to put it in a nutshell, our problem is not the management of hegemony or of hegemony arising. The problem is our complete provincialism. Not only German provincialism, Dutch provincialism, English, British provincialism, and a lack of a proper global outlook on what's happening around us. Anyone else?
I'll just say as a preamble, obviously as someone who originally comes from the UK, I just want to make quite clear that I'm not against unlike a lot of my compatriots, against the European Union project, but I still sort of remain concerned about, well, you know, I think, Don, you've just alluded to it. If you look at the present situation, you still have issues in Greece. Greece has slipped back in, I believe, technically into a recession. The Italy, which I frankly believe is just another bomb waiting to explode. This is a country that I believe has got economic growth below Zimbabwe over the last 20 years. You've got a banking crisis that's unresolved, with non-performing loans percentages as I believe have worsened. You've got a five-star populist movement which is in the ascendant and has been in the polls, leading the polls for the last better part of 6 months. You know, is there not a sort of an issue that, you know, despite the victories in France and Holland, which clearly welcome, that the European Union project is still a major risk, and that is compounded by some very difficult issues that are arising from my country's exit, because we then start getting to a very serious nitty-gritty issue of where is the money going to come from to fund the next round of EU projects that are going to be coming up in 2019 or 2020, I believe, when the new budgeting round. So my question is, where does, you know, is there not a sort of a concern, certainly with Germany, that the European Union project is by no means out of the woods? That, you know, the sort of the election results, while comforting, have still got a serious set of problems ahead of them to face, and no more dramatic than Italy, because Italy, believe me, is a bigger scale of problem than Greece. We're talking about a country that is the third largest public debt market in the world at present. You know, if there is a problem there, we're not talking Greece, which is, what, a few percentage of GDP of Europe. We're talking something of a bigger order of mass. So I'm still sort of struggling to find how Germany thinks it can come to terms or is going to resolve that, because I think you've alluded to it, albeit you may think that particularly Angela Merkel, represents the best values of Europe. But I think people are looking at, you know, the finance minister, Mr. Schäuble, and the way he's sort of handled negotiations to know that it's very much a Germany first in terms of the economic. Because I tell you right now, unless Germany is prepared to backdrop Italy, I think there are going to be issues for the European Union. I take no pleasure in that, believe me. So that's my sort of first question. How, you know, really what is, you know, how is Germany going to approach the still unresolved problems ahead of it? The second question is, do you think that the election of Macron is going to lead to the sort of the Franco-German axis renewing itself? Or is it really going to be a question that the poor economic situation of France is essentially going to exclude them from playing some form of dynamic in that? And then the final question, because obviously I've got 2 points for you, is how do you see these sort of elections in Germany playing out? There was some talk that Martin Schulz was going to lead an SLD renewal. That is now it's based on the last results, which I think they held power. Is it North Rhine-Westphalia for the last 20 years? They're out. So what do you see happening in terms of the results, and how do you think the Merkel next term is going to proceed?
Well, first of all, I mean, that is really a problem of our times, right? A few weeks ago, we spoke about the specter of a populist Europe in decay, which with the leadership of Le Pen as president, was basically doomed to be break up. She wins the election. Suddenly, she doesn't win the election. Macron wins the election. We suddenly have no problems no more. Populism is overcome. And of course, this makes me very hesitant because I think there are bigger problems still to solve, and only the very reasonable commentators now are coming up with them, because this has basically only giving us breathing space, those elections, for further going on handling those crises and its sources. And I think this is very much about agreeing on analysis. I read for this presentation yesterday again the arguments of Stieglitz, and I read also the reviews on those books I presented of Ulrich Beck and so on. Right? And of course, even the most unbalanced accounts, they admit that yes, one can criticize Germany, ordoliberalism, Europeanization of its own approach, not listening to others, not taking a holistic approach. But at the same time, one has to say that most of those problems, Greece, Italy, they are home cooked, right? And I mean, I would advise to look a little bit, they are home cooked to a huge degree. I would advise to look at it a little bit more in a practical way. If it would not have been for those packages for Greece, if it would not have been for those bailouts, we would have had the question of democracy, of preserving the independence of the Greek political system the other way around. As a bankrupt state, thrown out of the Euro system, maybe out of the Union, without proper finances, with the how much able would they have been?
I need to intervene.
To govern themselves at this point in time.
We must intervene, because this is again about neoliberalism and ordoliberalism. So, if you are a state, and you lend 60 billion to another state, then that is not aid. Angela Merkel has said, we Germans give a lot of aid to the Greeks. No, 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 no. This is a capitalist system. Any loan that is given comes with an interest rate. The interest rates on the early loans to Greece in crisis were astronomical. And this is by partners within the European Union.
You're talking again about the solution and not about the source of the problem.
It's about the capacity to actually be honest politically. I'm not accusing you of this, I'm accusing Merkel of this, right? I thought it was in terms of educating the German public to deal with the complex crisis that they are involved in. And they are not homegrown. They're crisis of the system, because this is part of the financial crisis. She should never have said this is aid. She should have said we are earning about 800 million euros per year on these loans to Greece. That is what she should have said.
Well, Germans know that very well. But we are again talking about the cure, about the instruments. We are not talking about the source. And whereas I agree to a certain degree with Josef Stieglitz, that basically, well, if one country or two countries, the Dutch I take also with, are running so huge surpluses, someone has to run the deficit. But this deficit is not the problem of Greece nor of Italy. The problem is huge public overspending, and this not only in a time frame of 5 years or so, but over decades.
And German underspend.
Over decades. Yeah? But underspending is not as problematic. It's not as problematic as overspending, because at a certain time you spend the money of someone else. You agree with me, especially if you share.
No, I don't agree, because
if you share a monetary union,
of where the money of me ends and that of somebody else has a political definition. That's not economics, and that's the whole point. So talking about this in terms of sort of property, this is our money, this is their money. It makes no sense. These are political, worldwide political constructions.
But there are, at the end, there are simple economic truths at the bottom of all this.
No.
Right? And if you overspend on such a systematic level for decades, that is where you land up.
German banks and Dutch banks that provided the money, and they were earning money from that.
True. Yeah.
You know, it's a system.
Okay. I don't think we're going to solve this question here, but I think this agreement on analysis to a certain degree, this is important to make, and this analysis of the sources, there we have yet room to improve, really. The second question, the third was about Germany in the elections. Macron. I think there's ample evidence that Germans, they very much accept, it is a talk of analysts, this kind of new asymmetry between both, right? But on the German, in the German political and in the foreign policy establishment, there is an absolute France first, or the special, this embedded relationship, how we call it, how certain scientists calls it, that this is basically the foundation of not only peace, but all other European projects for Germany. And France and this engine, this is the key. So I'm quite positive here. Although on the other hand, there will also be some demands. I'm pretty sure. I mean, how he right now imagines to take France forwards. I mean, on the level which is still clear, still a little bit shaky. I sometimes have the impression he wants to take, he sees Europe as an exit option for, so he wants to solve everything at the European level and push the problem on the others, while at home he wants to be rather soft, and he does not want to change much or be stricter in spending and in subsidizing the French economy, which might be wise to a certain degree. Germany, I think, with all due respect to the contenders, I think the election is very much decided. Since last weekend, when the biggest federal state, North Rhine-Westphalia, elected the CDU into government, there will be no other election in Germany until September. The AfD, the only huge contender to a CDU, which would get over 35% or so, is very much in agony. does not know how to handle the question of its radicals. Not much is spoken about the contender anymore. He has a certain loser image now due to the last 3 elections. It's very much decided. She seems to be full, as the time ahead is concerned, she seems to be full of energy. A very crucial question for the German political spectrum or the system and the development of things will be if there will be a great coalition again. We are slowly approaching the time. This has always been the preferred coalition of Angela Merkel, but we are slowly approaching a time when this becomes an existential question for the SPD, whether to be in this coalition, grand coalition, or not. And I could see that she might get another agreement with the Greens or the FDP, as long as numbers provide. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Andrea. Thanks for brilliant presentation. And let me ask a final question. You mentioned ordoliberalism several times in your presentation, and I wonder what's the relationship between ordoliberalism and the broader neoliberalism, and how does ordoliberalism fit into image of Germany as a basically corporatist society and economy? Or is the ordoliberalism basically neoliberalism with a German peculiarity, like there was a socialism with African peculiarity or whatever?
Well, I'm not an economist, which always has the benefit, if you are not an expert in something, you are forced to read again. So, and if I read again about those definitions and everything, you land up understanding that certain terms can have a quite different meaning than is actually superficially always assumed in the press or in public debates. Although liberalism is a neoliberal concept, but I think as such it shows very clearly that neoliberalism is not about complete laissez-faire. It is also about control to a certain degree. It is about a minimum degree of intervention, but it does not reject intervention into the markets at all. But I guess this is the most significant question we have right now. It is about how to control, how to get a grip again on globalization. If we cannot show, maybe this is the core problem. If the politicians who are re-elected right now are not able to demonstrate people they can regulate globalization in a way that comforts them again, then the concept of the West and its underlying capitalist system might indeed be in great trouble.
But very good. But just as an addition to that, so if you want to understand the relationship between ordoliberalism and neoliberalism, then the simple way to say it is ordoliberalism is the historical origin of neoliberalism. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Good.